Paul McGuire, and this is a prophetic emergency alert. This is a live, raw, uncensored, unedited version, a message that I wanted to get out to you directly in a very quick manner, in addition to our regular video broadcasts that you see on social media. And by the way, you can go to the Roku Channel. It's free, and listen to endless hours of Bible prophecy teaching that I give up to date at the Paradise Mountain church services. You can listen to it free, endless hours, by simply going to the Roku Channel. And Roku is built into most of the newer technologies, whether it's cell phone, laptop, big screen, or whatever. And if yours is an older version TV or an older version laptop, for a very modest amount of money, you can get the little electronic device that will enable you to get Roku. And not only will you get all the teaching I give, you'll get hundreds of ministries and great programming for free. So you need to check that out. I want to talk about where we're going as a nation, how fast we're going there, and what it means to you and I in the immediate future. And the basis for this is I've spent the last year heavily researching for my new book, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World. And in the process, I did an enormous amount of research, and the book it will be out very shortly. So if you want to get a discount off the price of the book, you simply go to paulmcguire.us now, and you'll get a discount off the book. Otherwise, if you buy it after the pre-order discount is over, you'll have to pay full price, and there's no reason for paying full price. I want to talk about this greatest battle that's going on in the hearts and minds of mankind. Now, what I mean by that, let's just take the United States of America, for example. We have countless millions of people in a wide spectrum of age categories: young people, students, young adults, older adults, so on and so forth. And what's going on right now is the most intense battle inside of the minds and hearts of all of these people. In other words, they're looking at their lives, they're looking at the challenges that face their lives, they're looking at their problems, they're looking for answers and solutions to their problems, and they're trying to evaluate internally inside their minds which ideas will work for them, which pathway will work, which system will work, which economic policy will work. And they're trying to figure all this out. And it's important, and of course it's important, because it's all about survival, it's all about freedom, and it's all about having access to at least some kind of abundance in terms of income, so you can live a life that's worth living. And really, that's a very important thing, having a life that's worth living, not just being a slave, working in a salt mine somewhere. So what's the nature of this battle? Why is this time different than any other time? And by the way, this time period that we're in now is different than any other time period in the history of the world and in the history of America, because we have this titanic collision that's been accelerating for decades, a titanic collision between two fundamentally clashing different ideas, or what could be called two fundamentally different worldviews. One worldview is the worldview that there is no God, there is no right or wrong, we're all here by evolutionary accident, and the fittest survive, like Darwin speculated. Might makes right, and if you're going to make something happen, it's up to you, your energy. It's mankind alone. It's you alone against the world. And many people believe that that's the truth, and as such, they're acting upon that. The other fundamental worldview, which used to be, up until the last number of decades, this worldview used to be the predominant worldview in America. And that's what we would call a Judeo-Christian or a biblical worldview, where people believe that we are created by God. There's a reason for our lives and existence, and that there is an absolute right and absolute wrong. And this Creator God has a plan for your life and for mankind. And that ultimately God is the source of everything, whether it's the need for material supply, food, jobs, or whatever. God is ultimately the source. And then behind freak weather and environmental chaos and social chaos or whatever, God is the source. And so these are two different worldviews, and they cause people to approach life from two different perspectives. And here's where they get into a clash. And we're seeing that clash play out in our society on the television screens, on the media, et cetera, social media, the internet, so on and so forth. We have a lot of people now coming forward for the first time in America. For the first time in America's history, we have major leaders coming forward and actually saying that they believe in socialism. And we have to remember that according to the definition of socialism created by the communist leaders, so they were the experts in terms of what socialism is. All the communist experts, the communist leaders, said in their writings and in their speeches that there is no such thing as socialism. Socialism is nothing more than a stepping stone into the real goal, which is communism and Marxism. So we have to get that finalized. We have to get that definition locked into place. Otherwise, we're having a meaningless conversation. So every time you hear somebody stand up and speak and say they're a socialist, if they're really being honest with you, according to the leaders of communism at its founding, there is no such thing as a socialist. Socialism simply means the stepping stone into communism and Marxism. So what they're really telling you, if they were to be honest, they're telling you that they're communists and Marxists. Now, let's lay aside for a moment the fact that 30 years ago, if you were to say that openly, people would have booed and hissed. Because our nation has been what is called a capitalist nation since its inception in 1776. And the idea that socialism, which is really communism and Marxism, the idea that that is an economic strategy or an economic plan that could actually solve our problems, and by problems I mean feed all the people, provide housing for all the people, provide great jobs for all the people, provide social justice for all the people, provide fair wealth redistribution for all the people, and that communism or Marxism is really the best system there is in creating freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of press, that communism and Marxism is the best system in fairly redistributing the wealth, creating social justice, and ultimately, all the leaders of communism, Marxism, and socialism have always said publicly that their goal is to create, and listen carefully to the words, their goal is to create heaven on earth, or a worker's paradise like the Garden of Eden, a worker's paradise, or utopia, which is a technological term for heaven on earth or paradise. That's their goal, is to create heaven on earth and paradise. That's a huge, lofty ambition. So let's get our emotions out of the side, put our emotions aside for the moment, and simply look at what the data, what the objective truth says, not what my opinion is, or this politician's opinion is, or that politician's opinion is. Let's just look at the facts. Let's just look at the facts, and there are plenty of facts. We can analyze the success or failure of communism, Marxism, and socialism over the last 120 years. beginning at the very first communist revolution, which was 1917. It was called the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. And the Bolshevik Revolution was essentially the communist revolution. Now, the first thing you need to understand about it, because you have to have some history. You can't have a wind tunnel for a brain. Having a wind tunnel for a brain may potentially solve the climate change process, but having a wind tunnel for a brain is not going to help you solve any other process. Now, I believe in freedom of choice. So if you choose to be an idiot, I'm not going to stand in your way. Go for it. If that's your goal in life, to be an idiot, then I believe in freedom of choice. See, I'm not a person who believes in censorship or taking away your right to choose. I believe with every cell in my being that you have absolutely the right to choose any system you want, including one that has never worked anywhere for anybody since it was started in 1917. You have the absolute right to go for that, okay? And I support you in it. So let's look at the historical facts. First of all, we need to understand that from the very beginning, communism comes about from a book written by a guy named Karl Marx. Everything I'm telling you are facts, by the way. It's not my opinion. I have all this written about in my book with documentation in my brand new book, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World. And you can visit other sources too to check up on my facts and documentation. But I've done my fact checking. And the reason I say that is because in our Orwellian world, run by big brother tech giants that are dishonest inherently because they're controlled by just 4 globalist corporations, whenever you want to ask a question on a search engine, and it's a question that has to deal with stuff like, is drinking water pure? Wouldn't you all want to know if your drinking water is pure? Well, it's not pure. That's the scientific fact. It's filled with toxic chemicals. So if you look that up in the search engines, you're going to get bombarded with these messages and links that say, fact check by Snopes.com, fact checked. And somebody you don't know, this particular guy, I believe, is in Scotland or Ireland, he checked the facts. And we can all have faith in him because, after all, we know all about him, don't we? So he tells us whether or not we can trust or believe the facts of somebody like me. Now, that's an act of absolute insanity because who's going to check the fact checker? Okay, who checks the fact checker? So what I'm telling you now is not my own personal opinion. The documentation is overwhelming. So here's how it goes. Communism, Marxism, socialism did not come about because the people. It was all when I was 15, 14 years old. I was raised in New York City in an atheist family. We were very leftist politically. I demonstrated in all the radical demonstrations on the left, by the way. My family is very much leftist today. And I demonstrated with the radical activists like Abby Hoffman. I was made an honorary member of the Black Panther Party, not the new Black Panther Party, the original, authentic, 100% real deal Black Panthers with people like Eldridge Cleaver and Huey P. Newton, okay, the chairman of the Black Panther Party. And the only reason I was made an honorary member is because I was white, and they told me that they couldn't make a white kid like me at 15 years old a full-time member, so they made me an honorary member. But that was fine because I told them, which was true, I supported the solidarity of their cause. Now, because I saw oppression against African American people that I felt was unjust. So when I examined this, and I was very much a part of the leftist movement, so I don't come from a capitalist perspective. I don't come from a Christian perspective. I come from an atheist, socialist, leftist perspective. And what I discovered at a young age, because people wanted to recruit me into what they called the movement. And the movement back then was the radical movement, the radical socialist movement, the radical leftist movement. And I was at all these secret meetings with the high-level planners of the radical movement where it was a people's revolution, we the people. And I was at the meeting where they planned out the first Earth Day, and where the radical activists decided in a private meeting that they were going to stop their movement that was based on the energy of the anti-war or anti-Vietnam protests, and they were going to redirect their energies into they were going to create the environmental movement as a reason to organize people, the environmental movement. And I was there during the planning sessions. So the point is, many people tried to recruit me into socialism, communism, and Marxism. And so I did some studying about it when I was like 14, 15, 16, and so on. And what I discovered, actually I knew it before I began researching it, what I discovered is that communism, Marxism, and socialism, this movement that we're talking about, these communist revolutions that we're talking about, were never started spontaneously by the people as the communists, Marxists, and socialists like to pretend they were. The people who bankrolled the communist revolution in Russia, they were the super wealthy international banking families. They were the super wealthy globalist elite. They were the big, super rich Wall Street bankers. And the globalist elite and international banking families, that's important that you really pay attention here, they financed and bankrolled the communist revolution in Russia. That's right, the super capitalist elite, Wall Street, financed the communist revolution. So you got to ask yourself a question up front: why would the super capitalist, super 1% rich elite class finance a communist revolution? Because, you got to ask the question, what's in it for them? So the two revolutionaries who basically organized the communist revolution in Russia were two guys. One was Leon Trotsky, and the other was Stalin. And both of them, and I'm not trying to be insulting, but they were kind of losers, okay? Trotsky lived in the East Village of Manhattan, where I used to hang out, and he published this newspaper kind of pamphlet that went out to about 800 people, and it was all about how great communism was. And then Lenin and Stalin, they both came in different time periods, but that revolution was financed by the same international bankers because they didn't have any money. So what happened was the international bankers, the super capitalist rich, and I explained this whole thing in my book, they hired these giant railroad cars that were, I don't know how many railroad cars long. They were like massively long railroad trains. And they hired several of them. And they gave people like Trotsky, if you were to look inside all these railroad cars that were traveling in from Europe into Russia, these massive railroad cars contained endless cars packed with machine guns, bullets, ammunitions, military-grade weapons, enough to arm, dozens of armies. These railroad cars were packed with bombs, explosives, machine guns, weaponry of every kind, so they could have their communist revolution. Who paid for that? The international bankers, the capitalists. And then some of the cars were just filled with stacks upon stacks of US dollars. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars US from the big super capitalist bankers stacked those dollars high in the railroad cars. And they went into Russia, and the Russian peasants, the common people, wanted nothing to do with the communist revolution. They weren't interested. You know why they weren't interested? Because even the Tsar, who was like the king of Russia and who was very wealthy, even though the peasants were workers and they weren't wealthy, they weren't all that bad off. I mean, they weren't like doing well, but they weren't doing lousy either. They could afford homes. They could afford to rent an apartment or a house. They had decent meals. They had warm clothing. They had decent jobs. I mean, it wasn't paradise, but they were doing okay. That's why they weren't interested in the stupid communist revolution. So the big bankers ordered Trotsky and the other communist leaders. They said, look, if the people won't support our communist revolution, then we want you to hire all the criminals, the rapists, the ex-convicts, the gangsters. We want you to hire all the criminals you can, get them when they come out of prison, and we want you to pay them money, cash. We've given you tons of cash, and we want you to pay these criminals to be your army. So they hired this criminal army, and they went city by city, and gradually, it took a couple of years, because again, the communist peasants were not interested in the communist revolution. But finally, because they paid all these criminals in cash, these criminals overthrew the governments, and eventually, because the criminals were heavily armed with machine guns and bullets and bombs, and they were getting paid so much cash, eventually the communists, which were really the international bankers and the super capitalists, they overthrew the Tsar of Russia. And guess what happened? Remember, this is a people's revolution. This is about wealth redistribution. This is about social justice. Okay? No rich class, no poor class. Well, none of that happened. Okay? What happened was the people who were part of the Communist Party became wealthy. They became the communist elite class, and they were super, super rich, the communist elite class. And then the ordinary people, peasants, they became slaves and worked at slave labor wages. They lost their so-so jobs, and they got slave labor jobs. And all the money, because the Tsar was filthy rich, all the money was sucked out of Russia, sucked out of the bank accounts of the Tsar. And did it go to the Russian people to help them build their workers' paradise? Of course not. All the money was sucked out of Russia and sucked right into the giant banks and vaults of the super capitalist international banking families. So the super capitalist international banking families now had millions, hundreds of millions of people that they could hire as slave laborers who were starving, who no longer had homes or apartments. They all slept in big rooms together. You weren't allowed to be married because nothing could be yours in this workers' paradise, in this communist utopia. Nothing could be yours. So if you were married, you had to share your wife with everybody. If you were married, you had to share your husband with everybody. You couldn't have any private property. Everything had to be shared, except for the communist elite. They didn't share everything, and they stayed right at the top. So this is the great secret behind socialism, communism, and Marxism. And most people don't know it because they don't read, they're not educated, they're dumbed down. I explain it to you in very simple terms. Fast-moving read. I explain what I call the dynamite truth, because this is explosive when you know it, of what communism is really all about. I explain it in my book, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World, which you can pre-order now and get a financial discount on if you pre-order it now at paulmcguire.us. That's paulmcguire.us. In a moment, we're going to continue on this emergency prophetic crisis alert because we're at the crossroads. I'm Paul McGuire. Hi, this is Paul McGuire. You're watching an emergency prophetic crisis alert. A little bit wordy, but that's what it is, okay? Because America's at the crossroads right now. Things are so serious, and there's no sensationalism, there's no exaggeration here. This is a sober analysis of what's happening. Any day, given the chaos and the level of chaos in our society or manufactured crisis, any day you could wake up and see our present form of government literally toppled, and we would be under martial law, which means a military police state where they suspend all of our rights in the Constitution, and we would be living in under a military dictatorship, like people live in all these wonderful communist workers' paradises. You say, that sounds extreme. You know what? whether it's extreme or not is an irrelevant question. The only question you should be asking yourself is not a response to an idiot mind control question like, that's extreme. No, you answer the question intelligently and you say, the issue is not whether it's extreme or not. See, they want you to, they know people are insecure, so they will infer that if you believe certain ideas or opinions, that you could be an extremist. And, that would kill your self-esteem and you wouldn't be liked at parties and people would laugh at you. So they control you. They control you because they know you're insecure and you don't want to be labeled an extremist. So people ask themselves, the idiot question is whether or not my opinion is extreme. Who cares if it's extreme? The question you need to ask is whether it's true or not. When the Titanic was sinking because it crashed into an iceberg, okay? You all saw the movie. Was it extreme to go up to the captain and the other men running the ship? Was it extreme to say, we heard rumors that the Titanic is sinking and we're rapidly leaking water? Where can we find a boat so we can survive when the Titanic sinks? Do you think intelligent people were concerned about whether or not their peers thought they were extreme or not by asking the question? Do you think intelligent people were concerned for 1 nanosecond about whether or not they would be perceived as extreme? Of course not. The only thing they were interested in is knowing the facts. Give us the facts. We need to know, is the Titanic leaking like we heard it was? Is the water pouring into the engine room and the lower decks? How much time do we have before the Titanic actually sinks beneath the surface of the water? And how many boats do you have? And how many people will your boats hold? Nobody cared about whether it was extreme or not. They just wanted the truth. So when I say to you, based on historical analysis and comparison, that we could wake up tomorrow and lose our present form of government and be under martial law or military dictatorship, the question of whether or not it's extreme is completely irrelevant. The only question is that scenario, in light of current events, geopolitically, politically, socially, and economically, in light of those events, is that even remotely a possible scenario? And let me attempt to answer it for you. And by the way, I go into detail of how that would play out, like very serious detail in my brand new book, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World. Because there are any number. Now, where I get my information from is not some website being published at Area 51 UFO, website, or what do they call it? They call it Woodstock or Area 51 stock. They're promoting Area 51 like it's a new Woodstock. I don't get my information from Area 51 websites. I look at think tanks, Central Intelligence Agency analysis reports, and many very heavy weight, intellectually respectable facts and analysis reports. And when you read them, they talk about what they call, by the way, these are their words, not mine. They talk about the doomsday scenario. The intelligence agencies are constantly talking about the doomsday scenario, or what they call the night of terror, and other apocalyptic type of projections of the future. And so they outline a number of potential hypothetical scenarios which could produce martial law or a police state. If we were to be hit by an EMP attack in the upper atmosphere of the United States, EMP being an electromagnetic pulse weapon, goes off, and it detonates in the upper atmosphere, where it's intended to detonate, because when it detonates in the upper atmosphere, an EMP that detonates with a nuclear detonation in the upper atmosphere is hundreds of thousands times more deadly when it detonates in the upper atmosphere than when it detonates on the surface of the Earth or partially underground on the Earth. Why? Because when there's a nuclear detonation, EMP, in the upper atmosphere, it causes a radioactive electrical pulse to blast out, and it could cover the entire United States, or a third of the United States, or two-thirds of the United States, depending upon the height and the power of the detonation. When that EMP pulse goes off, it will instantaneously shatter every single electrical, computer, EMF system that we have in America. In other words, an EMP pulse weapon, which could be fired off a fishing ship, an Iranian fishing ship, off the coastal waters of the East Coast, from a very small missile launcher, and detonate in the upper atmosphere. It's very easy to sneak these in, externally or internally. If it detonates in the upper atmosphere, it causes a pulse, and when that nuclear detonation causes that pulse to go off, it crashes our entire electronic control grid. It crashes the entire grid of every area. Okay, so let me spell it out to you. Now, I explain all of this in much more detail, important detail, in my book, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Souls of Mankind in the History of the World. First of all, you have to understand that everything in our society operates on electricity, EMF waves, radio signals, television signals. Our entire civilization is based on electrical signals. Everything. So even for the last several decades, every car that's been manufactured, in the last 25 years, I'm being conservative. Every car that's been manufactured in the last 25 years, if an EMP was to detonate, all the cars manufactured and trucks manufactured in the last 25 years would cease to work. Why? Because they are all based on computer systems. All the new cars have computer systems. You couldn't even start the ignition because they're computer generated. When an EMP detonation goes off, it short circuits all the computers in all the cars. So nobody could drive a car. That means every highway, every freeway, every road, people's cars would instantly stop driving. And nobody could move the cars. So here in LA, where we're broadcasting from, or any place you're listening to me from in the United States or across the world, if you're anywhere near an urban or a rural town or city, you would have millions of cars in LA. It's already a parking lot. You would have millions of cars and trucks come to a complete standstill. People would figure out rather quickly that they could not start their cars. They can't listen to their radios. They can't use their cell phones. So they get up and they walk away from their cars and they try to walk to their homes or to wherever it's safe. So you got millions, in just one city alone, you got, like LA, you got millions and millions of cars and trucks just stuck on the freeways and roads. So nobody, emergency vehicles, police vehicles, towing vehicles, ambulances, first of all, they probably wouldn't even run. If they do run, they couldn't get through the barricades of cars that are just locked in place. Then all your water supply would stop working very quickly. Why? Because your water comes from pumps, giant water pumps that are powered through electricity. They would short circuit. You would have no electrical power in your houses, no street lights, no store electrical power, no school electrical power, no hospital electrical power. Electrical power everywhere is over. It's gone because the grid is crashed. That means tap water doesn't run. That means you can't get heat. That means you can't get air conditioning. That means every communication system goes down. It means the cell phones don't work. It means your laptops don't work. Wi-Fi doesn't work. If 5G is there by now, they'll have 20,000 satellites and they'll work up there in outer space, but they won't work down here on Earth. No communications of any kind. It all crashes. What does that mean? It means all alarm systems are off. The police within, and I'm just giving you part of it. There's a lot more serious stuff that happens that I include in my book, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind. Police can't move anywhere. National Guard can't move anywhere. You have a complete paralysis of the system. So what it does is essentially throws back America into the 1800s. And to fix it, it's not like an overnight fix. It could take years to fix. And I just told you a little tiny glimpse of what could happen. And one thing I talk about in the book, and I don't say it for the purpose of sensationalism, but we are totally dependent in our society on communication system for safety and protection, like alarms and all that stuff, law enforcement, all that stuff. Well, we are now in a post-Christian society. We have been for 35 years. What that simply means is once upon a time in America, like when I was a kid, and it was moving away from Christianity when I was a kid, but once upon a time in America, not all that long ago, most people, whether they call themselves Christians or not, most people believed in Christian values, Christian morality. Most people believed in right and wrong. Most people believed in loving your neighbor as yourself, doing the right thing, being kind to people, feeding the poor, decency, love, okay? And whether they went to church or not, or whether they call themselves Christians or not, the average person in America embraced and believed in those ideas. So when we had the great stock market crash of 1929, where the system crashed, notice when you read the historical records that there wasn't mass looting, there wasn't mass rioting, there wasn't mass rapes and tortures and killing, there was not mass anarchy. You know why? During the great financial crash of 1929, there was not mass anarchy. The reason is that people knew how to govern themselves. They knew how to rule their own spirits because, again, even though they may not have gone to church or called themselves Christians, they embraced Christian principles like love thy neighbor as thyself. And that kept everything hanging together. Now, I talk about this in the book because it's a serious issue. We have allowed an elite, because that's what they are an elite, to take over our educational systems, beginning in kindergarten all the way to, getting a doctorate. We've allowed an elite, beginning in 1919, by the way, which is 2 years after the Communist Revolution. Beginning in 1919, we began to educate or indoctrinate millions of children in America and around the world into believing a whole bunch of stuff that wasn't true. And it changed our society forever. The first thing we did is we taught and brainwashed and indoctrinated millions of school children that Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was a scientific fact. It was absolutely true. And they had scientific proof to prove that the theory of evolution was true. So our children were exposed repetitively to a message that went something like this. Charles Darwin invented and discovered the theory of evolution. And it is a scientific fact. We have the proof. That's what they said. We have the proof that there was no God that created mankind. There was no Adam and Eve. That's all fairy tale stuff for little kids. That man came into existence by random chance and a total evolutionary accident. And how it happened is there was a rock somewhere on some moon, light years away, and somehow that rock evolved into a living species, maybe a little germ or something. A rock evolved into a germ, okay? And then the germ evolved into a completely different species, maybe a bunch of molecules and some kind of little biological creature, like a little fishy. And then the little fishy evolved into another little species, and it'll be a little tadpole, okay? different species. And then the tadpole, well, I was with my family in Maui like 20 years ago, and we went to this oceanography museum. And all these museums have become basically indoctrination centers for proving to young children and adults that evolution is true. And so I got to take my kids and myself and my wife to see at this famous museum, oceanography museum in Maui, to see a big statue, a lifelike statue of what the scientists called was a dinosaur dog. And what they said is this creature I'm looking at, it was a statue, it was part of the evolutionary chain, and at some point in the evolutionary chain, the DNA of a dinosaur and a dog somehow hooked up, okay? And it created a whole new species of being. So we had, at one point, the ancient dinosaurs. At one point, the dogs came along. But through through the scientific fact of evolution, the dog and the dinosaur became a dinosaur dog. And so we got to see a living sculpture of what exactly and precisely this dinosaur dog looked at. And it was like a massive, like, dinosaur structure, but it also was a structure that looked like a dog. The dog's tail and dog's eyes, dog's face, but like a dinosaur body. And, I started laughing. My wife started laughing. When we explained it to our kids, they started laughing hysterically. And, of course, the scientist was mad that we were laughing in the middle of her lecture on evolution, but we were laughing hysterically. We couldn't, it was like, the Mary Poppins movie when she's floating to the ceiling laughing. We were laughing hysterically. And we didn't mean to be rude, but the idea that there actually was a dinosaur dog was just so ridiculous, and they didn't have any proof for it, by the way. There was no fossil records. There was no scientific proof. Some scientist was smoking weed on Maui and came up with this thing, and so we were laughing our heads off at the preposterousness of telling children that there was a dinosaur dog. They've never discovered a dinosaur dog. They made it up out of nothing, just like the rest of the theory of evolution. So you see evolution, and then you constantly see these claims of how one species becomes another species and another species of a completely different kind. And then you get to the proverbial chart of a bunch of chimpanzees and then a whole bunch of apes. You've seen that chart, the chimpanzees, the apes, and finally Homo sapien, the first human being. And of course, he evolved into a separate species and from an ape species. Well, here's the problem with the theory of evolution. They have no scientific proof to prove anything that they've said whatsoever. That's why it's called the theory of evolution, not the fact of evolution. That's number one. They have no scientific proof. And number two is they have collected to date approximately 80 million fossil records. Fossil records of various life forms and species. And what they have frenetically been looking for over 100 years, what they've been frenetically looking for is scientific proof. They're just looking for one fossil record out of 80 million. Scientific proof that one species ever evolved into a completely different species. And after examining 80 million fossil records, they have never found once, not even once, they have never found even one example in a fossil record of one species that evolves into a completely other different species. Without that scientific proof, the theory of evolution is not a science. It's just a joke. 80 million fossil records, they have no evidence. Nada. Zero evidence. That's why they call it the missing link. What the missing link means is they need scientific evidence, like a fossil record, that proves that one species evolved into a completely different species. And they've never found that missing link or that fossil record. As such, based on the very rules of science itself, And I'll paraphrase them, but I wanted to be a nuclear physicist when I was a kid. I wanted to be a scientist, so I obviously knew about the scientific method and its rules at a young age, and you know it too. The scientific method demands that a scientist, you don't come up with something and say it's true because of your opinion, what you feel, what you think, what your hunch is. That doesn't make anything a scientific fact. A scientist must obey the scientific method. That means a scientist must have scientific empirical evidence that proves by facts whatever their theory proposes. So if they're proposing that mankind evolved over 300 million years and from one species to another, you would have to provide at least evidence in the form of fossil records, scientific evidence of one species evolving into another species. That's called the scientific method. So they have no scientific proof. They have no, what they call scientific empirical evidence. The truth is, behind all the blowhard stuff, behind the scientific mafia and their domination of, National Geographic and Scientific American and the Smithsonian Institution and all this, mafia type stuff where you fire any scientist who won't go along with the scam, they have no scientific evidence whatsoever to prove the theory of evolution is true. Big problem, wouldn't you think? Because after all, they claim to believe in the scientific method, but they have no scientific empirical evidence to prove their theory is a fact. Now, I go deeper than that in my book, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World, because that's just the tip of the iceberg of what they're hiding from you. That's just the tip of the iceberg. In a moment, we're going to touch on what's really underneath the surface of this hustle, this scam about evolution. Get yourself a copy of The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World. Know the truth that will set you free. You can order it now, and if you pre-order it right now, you get a discount off the copy of the book, and you get your copy rushed to you before it's available to the general public. And you can do that by visiting paulmcguire.us. That's paulmcguire.us. Hi, this is Paul McGuire, and this is a prophetic emergency alert. It's live, it's raw, it's uncensored, it's real. It's real because it contains the truth, not a figment of somebody's imagination. This is important for you to know. So you have indoctrinated, you have brainwashed, you've created fake posters, you've created fake movies, you've created fake diagrams, fake timetables, fake everything. Talk about fake news. This is fake science. To program countless millions of young people and adults, etc., into, you lied. You've told them. See, in the school system and among science, they usually don't say the theory of evolution. They kind of imply, they use wiggle room, and they imply it's a scientific fact, even though they have no proof. So you have told, indoctrinated, brainwashed millions of children into believing that the Bible is not scientifically true. The biblical God and Jesus Christ is not scientifically true. The story of Adam and Eve and the biblical creation account is not scientifically true. What's scientifically true, you say, because you say you have the evidence, which is called lying because you don't have diddly squat, is what you have. In fact, you should have a jar and some kind of, like we were at the Museum of Natural History in Manhattan, and they recreated an entire fake story of how men and women evolved from the apes and the monkeys. It was, it was an animation like Disney at its best, but it wasn't made by Disney. But it was all a lie. You should have what you call the diddly squat exhibit, where you just tell them that you're lying to them. Because most people don't know that you're lying to them. They trust you because they think you have integrity, because they think scientists have integrity. And a lot of scientists do have integrity, and they get fired. from institutions, they get fired from tenure, they lose money for research, and they get persecuted for daring to tell the truth. So, by lying to children for decades, you have told them that the theory of evolution is fact. And therefore, these following belief systems always accompany, in a person's brain, once you slam dunk in their minds that they're here by random chance, there is no God, you're here by evolutionary accident, might makes right, the fittest survive. Once you slam dunk that in their brains, the other stuff's a piece of cake. So this is what they sell you. They tell you that there is no God, no scientific proof. But we have scientific proof in evolution. Then they tell you that scientifically, there can be no absolute right or absolute wrong. There can be no moral right and no moral wrong. And you teach them that because you say, because scientifically we have proven that there is no God, because there's no scientific evidence that proves the existence of God, but we have proved scientifically. You lie. You say you have scientific evidence proving evolution is true, and you don't. You say that based on scientific empirical evidence, and again you're lying, that there can't be a right or a wrong or an absolute right or an absolute wrong because there's no God. All we are, this is what you tell the kids, all we are, folks, get over it, is evolved animals. Okay? We're evolved animals. So we behave barbarically like animals because after all, we're animals. So what you've done is you've scrubbed from millions of kids' minds the inner knowledge that God put in their hearts when they were born. You erase, through lies, you erase any concept of what's right and wrong because when they're young, they know there's a right and wrong before you got to them. You brainwash them into believing there's no such thing as right, no such thing as wrong. There's no moral code that we need to adhere to because there's no God. If there's no God, there's no moral code. Whatever feels good, do it. Which, by the way, when you teach kids whatever feels good, do it, that's just a heartbeat away from Aleister Crowley, the great Satanist, the satanic principle of do what thou will. See, do what thou will is just a heartbeat away from if it feels good, do it. Do what thou will means there is no God. You are the law and the morality. You are God. So whatever you will to do, because you're God, that's a Luciferian principle, you can do. No matter how obscene, disgusting, violent, and cruel, you can do it. Okay? That's what you're teaching kids. Then you teach them there is no God, there is no right or wrong, and then you teach them the sneaky stuff that you don't admit to the masses. You teach them racism. Yes, you do, and you know you do. Because you know that the intellectual founders of Darwinian evolution, if I'm assuming you're an educated scientist, maybe that's a leap of logic on my part. Maybe, in fact, I can't say that you're an educated scientist because that would be to violate the scientific method. If I presumed that you were an educated scientist or being educated and being a scientist were synonymous, that would mean I would have to possess scientific empirical proof based on factual evidence that that is true. And quite frankly, if I was to take a mass demographic of scientists and do polling and research, I'm not going to even come up with a theory because I don't have a theory. And I don't have a theory because I'm trying to be intellectually, scientifically honest. But if I was to research and poll, let's say, 35, 37% of all scientists, what percentage of those 37% or higher of scientists would you classify as being above average in intelligence and having an exceptional knowledge of history and philosophy? And it's not a yes or no answer because that's monkey business. That's what evolution is about. You would have to answer the question on the basis of a scientific empirical answer. You couldn't just say, yes, they have an above average understanding and knowledge the founders of science. You'd have to be specific, and you would have to say, Charles Darwin, essay question, and Q&A, and A, B, C, D, E, F. Did Charles Darwin, the founder of the theory of evolution, did he associate with the Huxley family, members of the British elite, specifically T.H. Huxley? And then I would ask you, every one of you, by the way, would have to stand in line and answer a question. It's an academic question. You would lose your tenure if you couldn't answer it. I would ask you the question, what role did T.H. Huxley play in promoting Darwin's theory of evolution among the elite intellectual class and academia and science around the world? And if you said, I don't know who T.H. Huxley is, or I don't know, you would get an F because you don't have a clue about the history of the own science you're promoting. So to refresh your memory, and if you indeed had one to begin with, T.H. Huxley, his nickname was Darwin's Bulldog. Okay, Darwin's Bulldog. T.H. Huxley's nickname was Darwin's Bulldog. That meant he used his power as a member of the British elite to champion so aggressively and so forcefully the theory of evolution that Huxley used his power and demanded that every scientist and intellectual and school system believe in evolution. That's why he was called Darwin's Bulldog. Now, T.H. Huxley was the great-grandfather of two other Huxleys, Julian Huxley and Aldous Huxley. And I would ask you questions you would have to explain on the question and answer accurately. What is the relationship between evolutionary theory and Julius Huxley and Aldous Huxley? You would have to tell me or tell the question, and if you didn't know the answer, you would get an F and be disqualified because you didn't have a sufficient education in your own theory of evolution. Because the answer, of course, and I'm sure some of you do know it, is that Sir Aldous Huxley, on behalf of the British elite, came up with the concept called the scientific dictatorship, based on Plato's belief in the legendary island of Atlantis, where Plato believed that Atlantis was ruled by 7 philosopher kings. And this provided a model of an elite scientific class, because of their superior knowledge, ruling over the ignorant masses. And then Huxley borrowed Plato's idea, modified by Sir Francis Bacon in the 1600s, and then in the 1950s, Sir Aldous Huxley created the concept of the scientific dictatorship, in which the masses are programmed and brainwashed through scientific mind control that is so sophisticated that they don't realize that they've been brainwashed, and they can be programmed to truly enjoy their servitude. So Huxley developed the idea of the scientific dictatorship. He wrote about it in his book, Brave New World. And then his brother, Julian Huxley, was the director of UNESCO of the United Nations. And as you know, he was responsible for developing the World Core educational curriculum, which includes Common Core. And of course, Julian Huxley, through UNESCO, standardized education all over the world and made it mandatory for school systems to teach the theory of evolution as if it was a scientific fact. So how do the Huxley brothers relate to the theory of evolution? Well, they promoted it in terms of educational indoctrination, but you have to also understand that when you read the writings of Sir Aldous Huxley and Brave New World, he very much believed in the science of eugenics. And as you're familiar, the science of eugenics is selective breeding. It's when man uses scientific technology to genetically manipulate DNA, pull from the pool of what you determine is higher level DNA, and produce, in effect, what Hitler called a master race by only allowing who you define as genetically superior to evolve. You manipulate evolution. And so in his book, Brave New World, what the scientific class does is they deliberately genetically engineer different groups of people: the alpha class, the beta class, the delta class, the theta class, different classes of individuals. And one class is an upper level managerial class. One is like a mid-level class. Then you genetically manipulate like a janitor, very, very low-level class. And to ensure that their intellectual development and their genetic development corresponds with their class, you breed them genetically through your own modified scientifically directed evolution. You breed them to be dumber. You breed them to be smarter. So they're actually genetically bred like racehorses to be dumber or smarter. And it was a prototype based on evolution that you secretly believe because you talk about it secretly in your secret documents, your secret briefings, your secret meetings, your secret papers. And it kind of came out publicly. It was embarrassing to you with Adolf Hitler because he just openly said, according to the scientific research of eugenics and genetics, Hitler said there is a master class that is genetically superior and there are inferior classes. And then, interestingly enough, the abortion clinics were placed in what you called minority neighborhoods. And those were neighborhoods of specific ethnic groups and racial groups that you deemed to be genetically inferior classes. So you increased the percentage of abortions. See? And you've been very involved in this for a long time. You're involved in this right now up to the present moment. Because secretly, it leaked out with Shockley. I'm not a scientist, but I seem to recall that he invented the transistor. And Shockley published a book a couple of decades ago, maybe 3 decades ago or more. William Shockley published a book and said openly, and he won a Nobel Prize for his scientific creation of the transistor. Shockley said openly that science has discovered that some races and ethnic groups are genetically superior to others. And of course, he was swept off the stage, but that's the secret belief system that's being hidden. And so if people knew that what they're being taught in schools is really, when you go to the secret door behind it, you really understand that it's a racial theory. Okay, let's put that aside for a moment. Let's get back to evolution. So evolution is based on no scientific fact whatsoever. That's the bottom line. No scientific fact whatsoever. And so you weaponized evolution to destroy a Christian God, Christian morality, Christian right or wrong, etc., etc. So now, if we're to have a crisis in society, like an EMP strike, detonating a nuclear blast in our upper atmosphere and crashing our electrical grid and sending us back to the 1800s, we now have tens of millions of people in any given nation, or hundreds of millions of people in any given nation, that when the power goes out, as it did, I believe, in 1976, it was called, Time or Newsweek called it the Night of Terror, and I happened to be on 44th Street and Broadway as I visually watched and was witness to the Broadway theater lights crashing and turning off right before my eyes, and as all of Manhattan went black, it blacked out right before my eyes. Seconds later, I heard screams of violence as looting occurred, and Time and Newsweek said the Night of Terror had begun. So now we have generations of people who have been programmed not to believe in a right or wrong, have no conscience, and they believe whatever feels good, do it, and they have no morality whatsoever, because you erase the morality from them, kind of like in a grotesque form of Stanley Kubrick's Clockwork Orange. You erased morality from them. And so if we were to have a revisitation of what happened in 1929 with the great stock market crash or some other catastrophic event, a meteor or whatever, a terrorist attack, it would be the law of the naked, brutal jungle out there in the streets in every city in America. There would be lawlessness, anarchy, murder, violence, rape, And I talk about other things that I don't want to talk about now on this program, but I talk about other things that are even more intense than that in my new book, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World. Why anarchy, looting, and going back to the jungle? Because the byproduct of erasing from many generations of young people and adults any sense of right or wrong, any sense of a moral code, any sense of absolute, any idea of loving thy neighbor as thyself. When you have erased that and deprogrammed that from people, and you instead now have programmed into them that you've taught them. This is your new moral code. You've said only the fittest survive. So the meanest, toughest, angriest, most ruthless person, according to your theory of evolution, has the right to dominate and control and slaughter when chaos arrives. You've created a moral and spiritual Christless vacuum where all hell will break loose in our society. Think about what you're responsible for. You have taken a vacuum cleaner and sucked the soul out of 100 million young kids, boys and girls, mothers and fathers. They have no belief in God. They have no belief in a transcendent love. They have no basis for believing love thy neighbor as thyself, or acts of kindness, or charity. There's no basis for that. You've robbed them from it. You stole it from it. And you did it on the basis of a lie. It'd be one thing if you did it on the basis of truth. Maybe we would just have to deal with the cards as they were dealt us. But you made the thing up. I hope you listening understand that ideas have consequences. Good ideas have good consequences. Bad ideas have bad consequences. I explain the good consequences and the bad consequences in my new book, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World. But in the book, I lift off the veil, because I'm not going to say certain things on video that I'll say in a book. Because you can do the math. You can do the math. We need, at this moment, proactively, God's supernatural intervention in our nation and society. We don't need to reject science. We embrace science. We embrace technology. We just don't embrace religion disguising itself as science. So we pray to the infinite personal living God of the universe, who, by the way, if you bother to read the book of Genesis, God has an enormously phenomenal understanding of species in the book of Genesis. Because notice, Mr. Biologist, Mr. Scientist, notice that when God creates the different species, he names them by name in the book of Genesis. And God then illustrates verbally his scientific principle behind be fruitful and multiply. And he says that every species, he doesn't use the word species, he calls it kind. Every animal will reproduce after its kind. He means species. Every fruit tree will reproduce after its kind, and so on and so forth. So God meticulously, in the book of Genesis, okay, this was thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago, before you even found your microscope, God gives us a depiction of his infinite understanding of genetics. Because what God explains in the book of Genesis, he explains his natural law, which he created in creation, and that is every seed reproduces after its own kind or species. And so man reproduces according to his own kind species. And on top of that, God gives an overall biological genetic mandate, and it's all encompassed in the words be fruitful and multiply. And God is giving man the prime directive that mankind is to be fruitful and multiply, not only via procreation and reproducing more humans, which, by the way, if you read the Bible carefully, is perfectly sustainable, because the mythology of the lack of sustainability based on population explosion, which you, by the way, got from a clergyman, not a scientist, Malthus, with his Malthusian theory in the 1800s, he believed, not on the basis of science, because he was a clergyman, he believed that excessive population growth was the number one problem facing mankind. And that's why we have hidden euthanasia programs going on all over planet Earth. It's to radically reduce population. But is it really a scientific fact that being fruitful and multiplying, growing the population, is the problem? Or is the problem a management problem and a greed problem? Because it looks like the reason people are starving to death and there's wars and mayhem is because when you look on planet Earth in cities, you see that in cities there is an excessive population and the resources, the food supplies, the water, and all the other things are being mismanaged and stolen by greedy governments, which leads to lawlessness and chaos. So is the problem indeed population growth, or is it a management problem? Is the earth, as they say, you say, those of you that believe in the mythology of Malthusian theory, you say that a 7 billion person population is unsustainable. You say a billion people is unsustainable. You say that we need to get down to 500 million people in order for it to be sustainable. But sustainable based on whose scientific measurements and whose scientific empirical evidence, not based on bias, not based on opinion. Show me the scientific evidence based on empirical scientific evidence that we face the threat of not being sustainable if we get into the range, let's say, of 15 billion, 30 billion, or 60 billion. Let's even go as high as 60 billion. Is it indeed true, based on the scientific fact, is it indeed true that the Earth is unsustainable population-wise? If you get my book, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World, you'll find that the truthful answer to that question is not in the realm of science, it's in the realm of occult belief systems that hide behind science. On one hand, you have a scientific elite, the scientific dictatorship, that pose as if they are scientific atheists and humanists. But in reality, they're practitioners and members of secret occult societies. You can discover the truth of that in the book and visit paulmcguire.us. That's paulmcguire.us. This is Paul McGuire, and this is an urgent prophetic crisis alert. Why? Because America is at a crisis point. And it's very important to understand that what a people believe as a nation, let's talk about America. What the American people believe collectively, what we believe as a nation, what ideas we hold to be true, whatever these beliefs are, and whatever these ideas are, good or bad, have and do produce good or bad or evil and good consequences. So ideas matter. It matters what you believe. I'll give you an example, going back to something we discussed a little bit earlier. And that is that implied, I'm not saying that the scientists are intentional, deliberate racists. I want to clarify that. There are some that are, but the majority are not intentional, deliberate racists. But the unintended consequence and the application of some of their theories lends that smaller percentage of scientists who perhaps do not have an inner integrity, it lends them to manipulate the facts or the pseudo-facts or the argument for evolution. They tend to exploit it to meet the need of their pre-existing bias, which is that a small percentage, are racists because they believe in a master race and then a lower race and a lower race and a lower race and so on. It's reflected in the literature. I didn't pull it out of a hat. It's reflected in the literature and it's reflected in the science. Now let me give you a completely different viewpoint regarding science, creation, and races that, because it is the truth upon which man's existence is based on, completely dismisses any notion of racism. You cannot be a racist You cannot believe in the mythology and lies that there's a master race and an inferior race. You cannot believe those things and simultaneously hold to a biblical worldview. It's an impossibility. Yet, if you're unscrupulous, you can derive from an evolutionary viewpoint, if you wanted to. You could manipulate the argument to attempt to support racism. Again, I'm not saying all scientists are racist, but there are some in history that have been. Hitler and his Nazi scientists were obviously racist. Okay, so what does the book of Genesis teach us? Because I believe the book of Genesis is an adequate scientific explanation for the origins of man. And I believe that the creation account on multiple levels is far more plausible, far more logical, and far more scientific than the opposing viewpoint, which would be evolution. And I don't even have to get into the specifics of biological detail. I could approach it from the argument of design or the argument of logic. If you simply look at the complexity and the design of individual human beings and babies, the complexity and the design of planet Earth, orbits, gravitational pulls, the solar system. If you look at the mathematical precision by which all of creation runs, if you look at the multi-dimensional nature of all of creation, let's not forget that scientists and science, modern science, boldly and emphatically stated, not all that long ago, it was the so-called empirical scientific evidence that the consensus among scientists was that the only thing that we can count to be true and real and have scientific validity are those things that we can scientifically and provide empirical evidence for, beginning with those things which we can perceive with our senses, seeing, hearing, tasting, touching. Those things which we perceive with our physical senses is sufficient proof that that is reality. If you claim that something exists and you cannot see it, and you cannot perceive it with your physical senses, then we as scientists have the full right to judge or call into question whatever your thesis is. So if your thesis is that you believe in a biblical God, but you can't physically show us the biblical God, we can't physically see the biblical God, we're going to say, based on our belief system, that there's no physical evidence that reveals the existence of God. We're going to say that it's a no-brainer. Science triumphs over Christianity and Judaism, because science is saying the only things that you can perceive with your physical senses are real, and that which you claim to exist, but you can't prove its existence through perception, through physical reality dimensions, is a myth, it's a fairy tale. Okay? The problem with that argument is that it was unsustainable. Forgive me for using the word sustainable. The problem with that argument is unsustainable. Science had to depart from it because science discovered a very interesting thing. Einstein began to bump into it. Other scientists began to bump into it. And finally, we had the discovery of quantum physics and string theory and other mathematical and laws of physics, which indicated and in fact proved to most scientists that it is not only the physical dimension of reality that constitutes reality, but that reality in nature is multidimensional. And the multidimensional nature of reality goes far beyond what you can perceive with your physical senses, like seeing and hearing and tasting and so on and so forth. You have other dimensions. You have at minimum at least 10, 12, or 13 dimensions in quantum physics. Or in string theory, you have anywhere between 10 to 12 dimensions in string theory. And these dimensions would be dimensions like space and time. Tesla would argue that there's a dimension from which we can get unlimited free energy that can be accessed with scalar technology. In any case, there is scientific evidence to support quantum physics and string theory, which at the very least, we come away with an understanding, a scientific understanding, that there are multiple dimensions, somewhere between 12, 13, or 10 dimensions in the universe. Now, as somebody who believes the Bible, by the way, indicated the existence of multiple dimensional reality thousands and thousands of years ago. So even though science has been dogmatic and steadfast in disqualifying any dimension which can't be measured through physical reality senses, the Bible very clearly and in numerous occasions outlined historical events that were transformed on the basis of the existence of a parallel universe, of a spiritual world, or another dimension that involved a spiritual world or a parallel universe. The Apostle Paul referred to it as a spiritual world. And you see time after time and example after example. The Apostle Paul talks about spiritual warfare between principalities and powers that exist in a spiritual dimension. When you read the story of Elijah's servant, and he cries out to help from God, Elijah the prophet says, "Open his eyes, God." And God supernaturally opens the eyes to Elijah's servant, and Elijah shouts out loud, "Behold, the hills are filled with chariots of fire." All of a sudden, Elijah's servant sees a massive, massive number of angelic armies that came in from a different dimension. And the chariots of fire appeared on the scene, but he couldn't see past the physical dimension. Suddenly, he sees the enormity of the chariots of fire that were sent by God to destroy the opposing armies of the king of Syria that were going to invade and massacre the children of Israel. So in history, Elijah and Elijah's servant and the children of Israel are able to win spiritual victory over the king of Syria because of these angelic armies that come in from another dimension and because of the chariots of fire that come in from another dimension. We also read the accounts of Jesus Christ as he walks through walls. Now, we have no explanation for that in contemporary science. But we also read about the fact that there is an infinite personal living God of the universe, that he lives beyond space and time. And so he lives in a dimension called eternity, where there is no time. And the throne room of the universe, which God rules and reigns the universe from, exists in a dimension beyond space and time. Eternity, and heaven will be in the dimension of eternity. So there are countless examples in Genesis to Revelation of multidimensional realities. Now, let's talk about, and this is something that for you to be proactive against the crises to come, for you to be proactive, for you to understand the nature of reality at its fullest dimensions, you have to have the mindset and educational development and intellectual development that existed in what we could call or classify ancient super civilizations. Now, some people believe that ancient super civilizations are mythological. For example, the Greek philosopher Plato believed in Atlantis. There is no consensus among Bible researchers or archaeologists or scientists or anybody that believes that for 100% certainty Atlantis, it can be proven that Atlantis existed. But we do know that ancient Babylon existed. We do know that ancient Egypt existed because of the documents of the Old Testament, because of ancient historians. archaeological evidence, the pyramids, the technology of the pyramids. We do not have technology today or engineering today that has the capacity to build these massive pyramid structures. We cannot scientifically and technologically build them today. So there had to be some access to some kind of advanced science and technology. If we look at the Bible and disregard our bias, our prejudice based on no facts, it's just an emotional bias which pollutes the scientific empirical method. If we look at the Bible and we read the account of, let's just say, two people in the Bible, one would be the prophet Daniel, and the prophet Daniel was sent by God to prophesy and interpret a dream from the king of Babylon regarding the future of the world. And many of his prophecies have come true, just like he prophesied. With the rise of four great world empires, they came into being as Daniel predicted they would. But the interesting thing about Daniel is that in these ancient super civilizations like Babylon, the king of Babylon, he had approximately 250 to 300 high level sorcerers, magicians, psychics, clairvoyants, people into witchcraft, occult practices, and the king of Babylon would counsel in terms of military, economic strategy, predicting the weather. He would consult in a very serious manner his court of around 250 to 300 high-level psychics, prophets, magicians, people with real occult powers. And you say, well, that's nonsensical. Well, let's remember that the king of Babylon at that time was the most powerful king of the most powerful empire on planet Earth. His expectation from his occult advisors was 100% accuracy in everything. If they failed to interpret or perform whatever the king of Babylon required of them in terms of occult or supernatural power, they were put to death immediately. So there could be no failure rate among the occult advisors. It was either 100% accuracy or death. Now that steps up your game real quick. So Daniel wanted to, he was called by God to advise the king of Babylon. And there was a battle in the invisible realm or spiritual world between powerful spiritual beings. Territorial spirits, like the Prince of Persia and the Prince of Greece, who were territorial or high-level Luciferian spirits that control the Middle East and the area of Europe. Then God's highest-ranking angels, the archangels, would have been Michael and Gabriel. And those high-level beings were in mortal combat, if you will, in another dimension, the spiritual world. So everything was stagnated. So when Daniel began to repent of his sins and the sins of the people of Israel, Gabriel was released to come to Daniel and get him into the court of the king of Babylon. Because the prophet Daniel began to function according to the laws of this invisible realm. So Daniel gets in there, and none of the occult advisors, the 250, 300 occult advisors, the psychics, these high-powered occult people, none of them could interpret the vision and the dream that the king of Babylon had. And the king of Babylon was furious because he's paying these guys big bucks. And he said, tomorrow I'm going to execute every single one of them. Unless somebody can interpret my dream or vision, they are going to die. They'll be executed tomorrow. Daniel found out about it. He was not allowed into the upper courts. He found out about it, and he had told the appropriate people in the chain of command of the king of Babylon that he could interpret the vision and dream that the king of Babylon had. So he went before the king of Babylon. He said, my God, he was meant the God of Israel. It's God who gives the ability to interpret dreams and visions supernaturally. He said it was God who gives us that ability. And he said, I need to spend time praying and seeking my God, the biblical God, and he will interpret your dream and vision for you. And so he came back and he interpreted the vision and the dream that the king of Babylon had. And being a rather generous man, the prophet Daniel requested that the king of Babylon did not execute all his occult advisors, even though they were competitive and apparently on two different sides of a spiritual war. So he interpreted the dream, and there were many facets to the dream, but the primary facet to Daniel's interpretation was this vision, this dream of this giant-like soldier, like a giant beast statue. And it was made out of various metal substances that started with a head, which is of gold, and then it descended, according to the bodily area, into lesser, like gold, silver, brass, and then it was finally iron mixed with clay for the toes. And each part of this giant soldier represented a futuristic or a present global empire or world kingdom. So Daniel said to the king of Babylon, the first part of the vision, the gold head, represents you, O king of Babylon, for the kingdom that it represents is the kingdom of Babylon, the mightiest kingdom of human empires. And that blew away the king of Babylon. And then he explained that one had to deal with Persia, and one had to do with Medo-Persia, and another empire dealt with a different area of the world, and then finally it got down to the Roman Empire and the revived Roman Empire. And that brings us up historically. Daniel had a supernatural vision of the four giant world empires in history in exact detail. And then the final empire is called the revived Roman Empire, and it's a mixture of steel and clay. And that applies to our time period because it talks about global government and a globalist leader leading some form of 10-nation or 10-ruler confederacy or union that is modeled after the Roman Empire. So this is a mind-blowing dream because every single one of the empires that Daniel predicted that would come into being indeed did come into being. And we're seeing the birth, what we call the new international order or global government, is the birth of this vision that Daniel saw. Now, on top of that, as a reward for prophetically and accurately predicting the future, God touched the heart of the king of Babylon, and Daniel asked him to release the children of Israel from their captivity. So they were released from their captivity. So what does this say? This says that in the world of geopolitics, in the world of military science, science and politics, economics, that there is a supernatural realm as well as a physical realm. There's a physical realm where we deal with things like the number of troops, how many chariots, physical chariots you have, the numbers of bows and arrows and swords, how many men have armor, of what quality is their armor, is there a river between these two nations that we need to cross in order to achieve military victory. You see, the ancients, both on the occultic, secular, and pagan side, as well as the ancient children of Israel, they had differing beliefs as to who God or the gods were, but they both agreed that there was a spectrum of truth and reality in which they believed. The commonality of all these ancient civilizations, and I explain this in detail and why it matters now in my book, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World. If you order the book now, you'll get a free discount, you'll get a discount off the book. You'll get your copy mailed to you before it's available to the general public, and you'll get an autographed copy. If you pre-order the book now, you'll get the discount, and it contains far more. I'm just giving you a little taste, because why I want to share this truth far and wide, and I need your help in spreading it far and wide, is God did not create his people to be victims when chaos or catastrophe come. We were never created to be to live in chaos or victims or catastrophe. Never, never, never. And so we're going to pick up on the higher spectrum of reality of science, technology, and how it interlocks in ancient super civilizations with things that we would relegate to, quote, the paranormal, like psychic ability, clairvoyance, sorcerers, magic, etc. You see, in ancient super civilizations, they were on one continuum. Even Sir Arthur C. Clarke said any sufficiently developed technology or science is magic. He wasn't just joking. He was trying to clue people in to a higher spectrum of knowledge. You're listening to Paul McGuire. You can get more information. You can spread this far and wide by going to paulmcguire.us. That's paulmcguire.us.
Okay, really good. You got to get this.
This is Paul McGuire, and we're continuing to talk about the prophetic crisis that's coming, but the prophetic destiny that's also on the horizon. And before I continue with this emergency crisis prophetic alert, I want to make it very clear that I believe that God has a unique and exceptional prophetic destiny for America. But in order for that prophetic destiny for America to be released, God's people must go through a transition where they stop they stop disobeying the Lord, because the Lord commands us continuously throughout the Bible, and especially in the book of Proverbs. It's the command of the Lord to his people that we are to pursue wisdom, guidance, and knowledge as if it were precious metals and gold and silver. We're to pursue with everything in us the acquisition of knowledge, guidance, wisdom from the Lord. It's not a take it or leave it proposition. Now, let's be honest. God's people have disobeyed that in a very serious manner. The proof of it is that the Christian culture is anti-intellectual, anti-art, anti-creativity, and in many places anti-science. None of which is a position that's taught by the Bible. As it pertains to creativity, it tells us in Genesis 1:1, God is a creator, capital C, and he's creative. One of the primary and the first characteristic that we learn about God's character is in the book of Genesis, where he reveals himself as a creator. Creativity allows us to take any message, like the message of the gospel, or the message of discipleship, or the message of loving people, or messages about anything that we need to communicate effectively. Creativity, the gift of creativity, allows us to both supernaturally enhance our communication, but using creativity that God has given us allows us to enhance our communication intellectually, creatively, and it takes something that is dull and it brings it to life. So creativity is essential in bridging the gap between those people who are either alienated by God and don't know God, and those people that do know God. God wants to bridge that gap, and creativity is an essential part in the creation of that bridge. It's also an essential part in understanding the nature of the prophetic destiny that God has given America, that God wants released. We have to understand that this nation was founded on the basis of a covenant made by the Pilgrims and Puritans based on Deuteronomy 28. The Pilgrims and Puritans in the 1600s dedicated America to God, and that's the primary reason God raised up America above all the nations on earth. That's an exact promise, not the word America, but the nation that worships the biblical God and hearkens diligently into the commandments and the voice of the Lord thy God. It says in that very first verse of Deuteronomy 28 that nation will be raised up above all the nations of the earth. And that's why America is unique and exceptional and has the freedoms that it has because of what the Pilgrims and Puritans did. So America has a prophetic destiny, but it is up to God's people to seek the face of the Lord, to renew their minds with the Word of God, so that the Lord can enlighten his people as to what his prophetic destiny is, not only for their individual lives, but as to what his prophetic destiny is for America in the last days. In other words, God is commanding us to fulfill a special mission in the end times. But we can't unlock the meaning of that mission unless we take the initial stages of obedience first. You're just not going to barge in to the throne room of God and demand to be given understanding regarding the prophetic destiny of America or your own life after you've spent 30 years or generations refusing God's wisdom and knowledge. It just doesn't happen that way. In terms of anti-intellectualism, look, let's get over it. Intellectualism is just a fancy word for people who understand things, who have knowledge and ideas. That's all intellectual means. So if God's people are anti-intellectual, what that means is they're anti-idea, anti-thinking, anti-knowledge. Well, I hate to break hearts of people that are married to a delusion. I hate to break your heart, but you can't, if you don't have the ideas of God, if you don't have the mind of Christ, if you don't have the knowledge of God and the wisdom of God, you can't possess the destiny of God for your own life or for our nation. America has a supernatural destiny. The only reason that there's an argument about this is that the people who are arguing over whether or not America has a prophetic destiny in the last days, and I don't mean this to be unkind, the only reason they're arguing is that because they've chosen to deprive themselves of both the biblical knowledge and the spiritual knowledge, the historical knowledge necessary to acquire the vision. Read Proverbs. God says, pursue knowledge, understanding, wisdom, just as aggressively as you would pursue precious gold, precious jewels, precious metals. You pursue that with everything in you. Well, God, it's his expectation that his people pursue knowledge, understanding, and wisdom from him with that same tenacity. So we have to possess the land that he's given us. Jesus said, occupy until I come. That means we are to occupy the land that God has given us. America's at the crossroads right now. And what's causing America to hang in the balance, it's a very dangerous precipice we're on, very dangerous, is that the American people, systematically through a corrupt educational system, have been scientifically dumbed down for many generations. Dumbed down people become compliant, non-thinking slaves because they've lost their ability to critically think, to use reason, discernment, objectivity, historical comparison, historical knowledge, so on and so forth. You have to acquire those things. And the only way you can acquire those things is by reading books that contain the truth, reading the Bible that contains the truth, learning, acquiring wisdom and knowledge that's accurate. There's no shortcut. You can't cheat on it. You're not going to walk around with earbuds in your head, bouncing your head back and forth, listening to mindless music, because the purpose of listening to mindless music is to do just that, make you mindless. Because mindless people are easy to conquer and to enslave. Thus, Aldous Huxley's Scientific Dictatorship. You can understand all of that in an easy-to-read manner in my book, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World, which you can get at paulmcguire.us. Okay, so this battle is going on. Now, what we saw in the lives of Daniel and in the lives of Joseph, because Joseph too approached the greatest ruler of his time, the Pharaoh, and I call them the Pharaoh god kings of Egypt, where the Pharaoh was an occult kingdom also, And he also had advisors, heavy-duty occult advisors, about 250 to 350 psychics, clairvoyants, astrologers, prophets, all kinds of heavy-duty occult people that he consulted with for his knowledge and wisdom. Now, God raised up a man, Joseph, who was sold into slavery, but ends up getting promoted, and he's put in a position supernaturally by God where he has to interpret a prophetic dream that the Pharaoh had. And the prophetic dream that Joseph is going to interpret is an economic forecast prophetic dream. So he interprets the dream of Pharaoh and says to Pharaoh, you're going to have, here's the meaning of the dream, you're going to have 7 years of plenty and 7 years of drought. He was speaking of the agricultural production primarily of wheat and the harvest of wheat. God was speaking through Joseph to Pharaoh and saying, you're going to have 7 years of plenty. The rains are going to come down. You're going to have an infinite amount of wheat. But you need to obey the prophetic warning in the dream, and you need to gather that wheat and store that wheat, because immediately following the 7 years of plenty, there's going to be 7 years of drought and a baking hot sun, and anything you try to grow is going to be scorched earth policy, burn up. So not only does God download supernaturally into the mind of Joseph a supernatural prophetic economic forecast, he also downloads an entire series of supernatural wisdom that involves architecture, it involves engineering, it involves administration, organization, and all these very high-level thinking abilities and talents and giftings that he was not trained to do in the natural. Now notice that all the heavy-duty occult advisors, the sorcerers, the magicians, the astrologers, they couldn't interpret the prophet's dream. Only Joseph could. So Joseph tells the Pharaoh, during the 7 years of plenty, you're going to have to store your massive amounts of wheat and grain in massive storehouses so you can survive the 7 years of drought. But God supernaturally amplified and enhanced his intelligence. So there was more than that. And so what he said to Pharaoh was this. First of all, Pharaoh realized that this guy was not a fraud. This guy had real prophetic gifts and natural gifting that he didn't know where he got it from, but this guy shows up and is a super architect, a super administrator. And so Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler on planet Earth, essentially makes Joseph the co-pharaoh. He gives him a signet ring representing the full authority and power of Pharaoh in Egypt. He gives him Pharaoh's chariot, and he basically allows Joseph to rule and run things. And so what Joseph does is he does stuff that has never been done before in human history. He has to architecturally create superstructures, most probably the size of Super Bowl stadiums, numerous Super Bowl type stadiums throughout the land of Egypt that can contain and preserve these massive super harvests of wheat and grain at an unprecedented level. But not only did Joseph have to architecturally and scientifically and technologically create the design of these buildings, they had to be temperature proof. They had to not have any moisture, or they had to make sure there was no rats or insects, because this massive amount of grain in the baking hot sun would have been very vulnerable to pestilence, to degradation, to the rotting of the grain and the harvests. So he had to create what was never created before, superstructures to hold the massive storehouses of grain. So think of what God downloaded in the mind of one individual who was sold out to God. In addition, he instantly had the administration abilities, the economic abilities, the organizational abilities to run the entire Egyptian empire. And he didn't have the advantage that Pharaoh had. Pharaoh was trained from boyhood how to do all those things. He had to walk into it instantly. That is mind-blowing, the intelligence that God gave his servant Joseph. And so what happened was, there, in both the cases of Daniel and Joseph, there is an engagement between the occult, the powers of the occult, which were very real. Nobody was laughing at them. There was an engagement with the powers of the occult, with not religion, with not playing church, but two among the endless numbers of supernaturally authentic, totally awesome men and women of God that have been raised up throughout human history, never been given credit, but have solved global problems, right and left, in empire after empire. There's been a succession of men and women like Daniel and Joseph and many others. Many of these are females, many are males. Some served in the most humble and obscure positions, but their one word changed destinies. And so when I hear these ridiculous theological arguments that represent a total poverty of understanding of the magnificent, infinite, agape love of Jesus Christ, that represent the heart and love of Jesus Christ. And then when we compare, as we should compare, the crisis events in ancient Egypt with the wheat and grain, and the crisis event of the coming empires interpreted by Daniel, and the deliverance of Almighty God, not only in releasing the captives out of captivity in Babylon, but the fact that Joseph used the wheat and the grain to buy up the geographic territory of empires all around Egypt, thus expanding the empire, and he totally funded and gave food supplies to the children of Israel who had to survive in order for God's prophetic program to be fulfilled. Not only did that happen, but there's case after case, episode after episode of men and women that were raised up by God throughout the Bible and in history, who were raised up despite the fact that they were imperfect. If you're making perfection the criteria for whether or not God can use a man or woman supernaturally beyond your wildest imagination, you have a fatal flaw in your analysis. Because some of the greatest men that God and women that God used were fatally flawed. A case in point would be David, who was given supernatural administration gifts, business gifts, the talent to run an empire, military science gifting. Yes, we know he sinned. He committed adultery, he murdered, he lied, he went through hell. But he was the only man that God said was a man after his own heart in the entire Word of God. And some of you have the ignorance to dismiss imperfect men and women that God has used in previous generations, that God is using in this generation. You question ordinary, imperfect men and women that God is using for his purposes to deliver you. Because that man or that woman doesn't meet up to your standard. But you have a problem. Because however imperfect they are the man or woman that God chose to function as your deliverer in a time of crisis. I think you need to quit wavering between two opinions and decide whose side is the Lord on. And that's a question that transcends political party and transcends normative definitions like conservative or liberal. It descends, it ascends from that, it transcends it. So God, throughout history, gives supernatural answers to men and women in times of crisis. We see Noah, and Noah is commanded to build an ark. That took incredible skills. And he builds an ark, and they go, and God selects the animals, the species that are to survive the flood, and Noah and his family and his wives go into the ark, and God supernaturally delivers Noah and his family and the animals. He delivers them supernaturally. That's speaking to you. That's speaking to you. And God delivers Lot supernaturally. That speaks to you. There's case after case after case of God supernaturally delivering his people, either in the midst of crisis or delivering out of crisis. We have to come to the place where we understand. And this is what I've tried to focus in on in my book, this message. This very message I've tried to focus in on my book, The Greatest Battle for the Hearts and Minds of Mankind in the History of the World. Because the only way we can win the battle, the greatest battle, is by creatively, under the anointing of the Holy Spirit, and not having premature conclusions that are false and not based on God's word. Having our theology in agreement with what God's word really says, not what we think it says. We have to be open to the possibility that God may just want to use your life and people you know in the most profound supernatural manner to be a world changer. And it's going to require that you develop yourself incrementally. But more than that, we have to come to the place where we understand. We can't just cheaply interpret the Word of God. And I don't have time to explain that. It's in the book. I'm not just trying to sell a book. It takes time to explain it. God has a prophetic destiny for America. God wants to release that prophetic destiny. It has everything to do with the love of God. It has everything to do with God's mercy and unmerited favor on his people in America, because it is unmerited favor. And it has everything to do with the fact that God is love, and it is the desire of God to populate heaven with as many people as he possibly can. With God, the invitation is open to billions to come into the kingdom of heaven. God does not believe in population control. He believes in everyone is created as his child. Therefore, God is not a racist. It's impossible for God to be a racist because he created every race, and he delights in every race. So God, the prophetic destiny for America that God has involves the fact that we must seek the Lord. We must get the understanding that's already out there. And then we need to be obedient, because it's only when we have the supernatural knowledge and wisdom and plan of God that God's prophetic destiny can be released, and then we bring in a massive last days soul harvest that will total hundreds of millions, if not billions of people on planet Earth. Because if they're not brought into the kingdom of God, the evil one intends to exterminate them. So there's a clock ticking. We have a call from God. And that should fill you, as it fills me right now in this studio. It fills me with a sense of God's holiness and a sense of fear and trepidation as I and you stand before a holy God with the appropriate trembling that is due, knowing that we are mortal and imperfect men and women, and yet we've been chosen for such a great assignment. Because God said in his word, for God knew you before the foundation of the world, and he called you for such a time as this. God bless you. I'm Paul McGuire. Visit paulmcguire.us.